Pocketables Weekly News Roundup number 9. This week has been interesting for things both big and small. So on the big things this week, we have the new Ryzen 5000 series processors launching. And there is a lot to take in here with these, even though it's only 4 CPUs. One thing I'm going to give AMD credit for that Intel never really seems to get right is just the number of CPUs. Before we even talk any of the performance numbers, AMD always launches less processors with larger gaps between them. That makes selecting chips a lot easier on the AMD side when you're not guessing what's the difference between this one and this one that are 0.1 gigahertz apart. So right away, we'll give AMD credit for that. The new Ryzen 5000 series chips are packing the new Zen 3 microarchitecture, which has done a little bit of rearrangement on how CCXs are handled. They've moved from 2 CCXs per die to 1. Seems like we're slowly working back towards making things more monolithic, at least in the processing cores. The move to a single CCX per 8 cores means that Ryzen 5 and Ryzen 7 chips only have a single CCX. That's going to mean more consistent performance to things that are still sensitive to the latency communicating between CCX units. For this generation, the Ryzen 5 and the Ryzen 7 processors, 6-core and 8-core chips can be made with a single CCX and a single I/O die. We are getting a pair of Ryzen 9s that are all launching at the same time. We are getting a 12 and a 16-core chip, and those both have a pair of CCX units, although I don't believe it's been disclosed if the 12-core chip is going to use 2 6-core CCX dies or potentially one 8-core and one 4-core die. Realistically, they could build it either way and it would work either way. There's just going to be some differences in core-to-core communication latency between things being a little more balanced with 6 on each side and potentially having an extra 2 cores on a single die with an 8 and a 4. So I'd love to see some testing that validates which way they're doing that if they're consistent with how they're doing it. As far as real performance numbers, we have IPC improvements across the board, we have clock improvements across the board, and we have the same exact I/O. So let's talk about I/O since that's the simple one. One of the great benefits of moving to this chiplet design that AMD has used for several generations at this point is that they were just able to reuse the previous I/O die. And I don't see anything wrong with having done that. There may potentially be some small tweaks and refinements that haven't been disclosed just to improve yields or get a little bit more frequency out of it on the memory controller. The normal process refinement you see as something is produced for an extended period of time, but fundamentally this is the same one that we had on the Ryzen 3000 series processors. We're getting the same exact NVMe, we're getting the same exact I/O. That includes PCI Express, SATA, NVMe, USB. All of it is unchanged, at least on the existing motherboards. All of it is unchanged, which is good. You know exactly what you're getting if you buy a Ryzen 5000 chip and drop in an existing motherboard that has BIOS support for it. And you are not missing any features that you might have gotten had you purchased a new motherboard with your CPU. So that's an excellent touch. On the CPU side themselves, like I mentioned, we're getting increases in frequency across the board. These are still 7 nanometer chips, so we don't have a die shrink. We do have what's being claimed as a 19% IPC increase. And they've actually broken this down into where they're getting some of their increases in performance. Some of which look like they just come from the virtue of moving from a pair of 4 CCX units to a single 8 CCX unit on a compute die. So we have an increase in cache prefetching, an improvement in the execution engine, the branch predicator, the micro-op cache, and these are all small 2.7, 3.3, 1.3. These are all small increases, but these all add up. And they're saying the geometric mean of 25 benchmarks that they ran, which take that with a grain of salt. This is a vendor number, and not that we shouldn't be able to trust our vendors, but they are inclined to pick things that make them look good. So they're saying the geometric mean of 25 benchmarks that they ran, a mixture of real world and synthetic, we're seeing a 19% uplift in IPC. That is, we'll round it off, we'll say that's a 20% generational improvement. It's been a while since we've seen something like that in a CPU. And if that's true, those few edge cases where Intel's 10th gen chips, which are still held on that 14 nanometer process, would win out, may have just been handed over to AMD. So that's not to say that things exist in a vacuum. We're going to see new Intel chips soon, but if Intel doesn't increase performance massively with their next CPU launch and decrease price, they're going to be on the same back foot that they've been in on a while, and the last few bits that they could really hold things back and say, well, we're better at this, we're better at this, we're better at that, are rapidly disappearing. So I'm looking forward to people getting their hands on the Zen 3 Silicon, getting some independent numbers, so I'm not just taking AMD's information without any validation. I still don't see myself building a AMD system in the near future, but that's just because I prefer to grab used workstation hardware and retrofit it. As far as the cost performance is concerned, as we saw in the gaming PC we built out of an old small form factor desktop. Another announcement AMD made during their event, which is more of a teaser than released information, is a little bit of information on the Radeon RX 6000 series cards. So we got to look at one, she held it up, and we got a few benchmark numbers showing 60 frame per second plus performance at 4K, but that's all we got. We got that little bit of information. Now, information is good. It lets us figure things out. As I mentioned earlier, these are vendor-run benchmarks, so we don't have the full details, and we may see different results when reviewers get their hands on the cards. The way it is now, it looks like the RX 6000 is shaping up to compete with the RTX 3080, which isn't a bad place to be competing at. And it's not to say that I wouldn't have preferred they release something that could make the 3090 look bad. It's always better to just beat your competitor outright than to let them have the top of the product stack. But numbers comparable to a 3080 means that they're at least going to have a competitive video card. That means that the choice between do I get an Nvidia GPU or do I get an AMD GPU won't be clear-cut in favor of Nvidia, as it has been as we're waiting for these to show up with just how powerful the RTX 3000s were, if you can get your hands on one. The use of AMD's Navi architecture in consoles as well may mean that we'll see various games actually prefer the AMD cards. And what I mean by that is if I take two cards that have identical performance characteristics, at least on paper, and I run, we'll say, 10 games. Games that were developed with the help of Nvidia, so things with GameWorks logos and stuff like that, are going to generally perform better on the Nvidia cards. Games that were ported from hardware and originally developed on equipment using AMD's Radeon architectures, whichever variant it may be, are generally going to prefer AMD cards if the cards are 100% equal otherwise. And we see this all the time. We'll see cards that, 5, 6, 7 benchmarks, everything is in favor of one card, and then suddenly, for no reason, at least no immediate reason, the next benchmark is a massive landslide win for the card that hasn't been performing at all in the testing. And that's because it is better optimized to run on that architecture. As with Zen 3, I look forward to getting more performance numbers on the RX 6000s. I want AMD to be competitive here just because I use a Quadro, Nvidia card in my desktop. Doesn't mean that I want AMD to do badly here. Competition is good for everyone. It keeps prices sane and it brings performance along with it. So I'm looking forward to this event. I believe it is October 29th for the actual release event on the RX 6000, which is only a few weeks away at this point. On the small side of the world, Nvidia is releasing a new Jetson Nano board. If you weren't familiar with the previous Jetson Nano board, there was a Jetson Nano 4GB which contains 4 Cortex A57 cores at 1.43 gigahertz with a 128 core Maxwell GPU. Now, Maxwell might not be the most exciting or newest microarchitecture out of Nvidia. In fact, Maxwell showed up with the 7 series, which actually comprised of 3 different generations of cards. We had Fermi and Kepler and Maxwell cards were all included in the 7 series, but Maxwell cards stuck around for a long time. Even some 900 series cards, I believe the 950, were based on the Maxwell architecture, so it's not so old that it's useless. So they've got a 128 core Maxwell chip, which isn't huge. That's what you'd see towards the lower end on some laptops, but 128 CUDA capable cores is going to be enough for AI accelerated workloads on a single board computer. So the 4GB Jetson Nano has been around for about a year, and now we're getting a cost reduced 2GB model. So where that cost cutting comes from, fortunately, isn't any of the CPU or the GPU side of things. It's still quad-core A57 at 1.43 gigahertz. It still has 128 Maxwell cores at the same frequency. It is losing memory. We're going from 4 gigs to 2. It's also losing a couple of ports. The 4GB Jetson Nano has 4 USB 3.0 ports, whereas the 2GB model has 1 USB 3 and a pair of USB 2s, but it does gain a USB-C for power instead of using a barrel jack connector, which is a nice improvement. And they're both 10-watt boards. So if you have an AI workload that could benefit from a GPU, I would love to see something like this used for, I believe it's Mycroft is the open source competitor to things like Google Home and Alexa. I'd love to see something like Mycroft take advantage of those Maxwell cores to do more compute on the units themselves. Other things that could definitely benefit from it, I mentioned AI, so computer vision, things like image recognition with cameras are definitely going to benefit from it. The Jetson Nano is a little bit limited on having 2 gigs of RAM. I've heard reports that if you run it without the graphical user interface for the software that's available for it, you get roughly the same available memory as if you were to run it with the graphical user interface enabled. I believe it also has a PCI Express capable interface, so if you wanted to augment your capacity with, say, a small NVMe drive, which, granted, that's expensive and something that it may just be better to buy the larger unit and turn off its GUI instead, but you could throw on, say, a small 128 gig NVMe drive and have a lot more room to play with, at least as a page file, which granted is lower performance than RAM, but is still better than paging to a micro SD card. All that said, I'd love to get one. I think they'll be fantastic for AI stuff. The 2 gig model may prove popular for things like video emulation, or console emulation, I should say. Not that the Pi 4 does a bad job of that, but having the improved GPU there could help with some of the features, various filters and things that the Pi 4 doesn't necessarily do fantastically at, or has to use a lot of CPU time when it would be much easier to just throw it through a CUDA capable graphics card, which may make porting things from the PC easier as well, since if it works on a CUDA card there, it'll work on a CUDA card here in theory. So it's interesting. I like seeing more single board computers. It's nice to see competition. Not, like I said, not that the Pi 4 is bad. It actually has a more powerful CPU and is available as an 8 gig model at what this is asking for a 2, if your particular project is really memory dependent and doesn't have any reason to benefit from CUDA cores. With that said, competition is good, and we'll actually have a link to the developer kit. It's available on Amazon today, so this was a very quick, it's been announced, now it's available. There'll be a link in the description below. So this is one that I can't decide if I love it or hate it. Google announced this week that Chrome for Android is going to be able to check if your passwords have been compromised and tell you if it's time to update things. On one hand, I don't really like Google having my passwords. I don't like the idea that they're going to send them out and validate them against a list that they have, even if that list theoretically is encrypted. And the reason I don't like that is that means that passwords are going to be transmitted over the network using encryption, which no encryption is perfect, and may be more vulnerable to being cracked. So if they're running this encryption on the end user devices, it can't be anything particularly massive. I mean, it has to run on Android phones, big and small, and can't just burn all your compute time for 5 minutes running some ridiculous encryption scheme. That means that if I wanted to generate a table to check what these passwords were, it probably wouldn't be super difficult to do. Now, yes, they can salt the passwords and run things through encryption that's unique to the device, but if I'm validating it against a list, that either means that I need to be able to decrypt it at the other end, or the list has to be encrypted the same way. So I would love more details on how they're encrypting it, because my concern here is that I'm going to be able to pull up to a large commercial building, look for traffic that looks like Chrome validating passwords, and walk out with corporate accounts or anything else. And I know you can say Wi-Fi is encrypted. Well, Wi-Fi encryption isn't that great either, and it's, I'm not going to say trivial to break, but fairly easy to break compared to other things, because once again, it's encrypted, but the encryption's not super huge. You know, it has to be something that can run on your wireless router in both directions, and there's known flaws in some of the schemes. WPA, WPA2, there's known flaws that allow these passwords to be decrypted rather quickly just by watching the network traffic. So, but I also don't like the idea of people going around with passwords that are compromised and not knowing that their password for their 50th Yahoo email got dumped in this week's leak because somebody can't figure out how to secure their web server. So, overall, I think this will be a good thing up until it falls apart. And hopefully Google's encryption for this is a moving target. So Dell this week launched a new assortment of ultra sharp monitors. We are getting a couple of different things this time around, some of which I'm actually really excited to see. So we're getting and as much as I love ultra sharps, these names get to be terrible sometimes. U2421E, which is actually available today, and this is a 24-inch USB-C monitor with a hub built in that will provide power through that hub up to 90 watts. So that's offices and environments like that are absolutely going to love not having to buy separate docks with their new USB-C laptops. They can just buy this monitor and plug everything in. The price is a little bit on the higher side because you're basically buying two devices integrated into one at $449.99. It's also packing a 16:10 aspect ratio, which is something that I wish we had never gone away from. My laptop in college, over a decade ago at this point, had a 16:10 widescreen. And although I fully appreciate how much more powerful my existing system is, I do miss the additional vertical height, even if it was the slightly odd 1680 by 1050 resolution. That said, the U2421E is going to pack a 1920 by 1200 screen. Not huge, not terrible at 24 inches. I have a pair of 1920 by 1200 24-inch Dell Ultra Sharps on my desk that I use every day. They're the portrait monitors on the sides of my larger 43-inch 4K panel. So I like 1610 there. 1920 1200 looks good on a 24-inch screen. I know it's not 4K, it's not 2560 1440, which would actually be 2560 1600 at 1610, but it is a nice panel. It's going to come with good color because it is part of Dell's Ultra Sharp line. Ports on it are going to include additional DisplayPort and HDMI for second or third monitors, USB-C as well as USB ports for connecting end devices, phones, mice, keyboards. I don't believe this model has an integrated webcam, so probably a webcam. There's also going to be a 34-inch model, the U4331WE, which is packing a mostly similar hub, although the HDMI revision is bumped from 1.4 to 2.0. It's also an ultra-wide panel at this point, being 3440 by 1400. I don't like ultra-wides. And it's not to say that I don't think that they have their uses, but personally, for the things that I do and the way my desk is set up, I don't see the benefit of an ultra-wide. Just like I'm not a huge fan of curved screens. That said, there are plenty of places and instances where having an ultra-wide would be benefit. I've seen them be beneficial to video editors who can have a much longer timeline. I do that just by having a massive 43-inch 16 by 9 panel. Not necessarily the best solution, but it's the one that I picked. They look great if you want to make displays on posts for various signage. It gives you a nice vertical screen there. So ultrawides have their place, and hopefully we get other options. Well, I mean, there is another panel that they launched today that is an ultrawide, so for the people that need it, there will be that ultrawide. It's going to be $1199.99. It's a little bit expensive at a 34-inch panel, but they're banking on that USB hub, and Dell likes to bring their panel prices down when you buy them with systems. So I don't anticipate these prices to stay where they are for very long on any of these panels. Last panel they announced this week, the UP3221Q. This is a 32-inch panel aimed squarely at the same market as Apple's Pro XDR. So this is a 4K 60 Hz panel with a 98.8% DCI P3 color space and a maximum HDR brightness of 1000 CD meters squared. The SDR maximum brightness is around 350 CD meters squared, a little bit more reasonable. This is a 16:9 panel again. I would have liked this to have been 16:10. Would make it stand out a little bit more. But it's going to pack DisplayPort 1.4, a couple of HDMI 2. We get Thunderbolt 3 up and downstream, as well as USB and a special colorimeter port, which is not something I have a ton of experience with. I used a colorimeter when I reviewed the VOTech panel, and was fairly pleased with where it was for a VA matrix, but I've never seen a panel with a dedicated colorimeter port. Now that may allow the panel to calibrate itself with a specific model of colorimeter without relying on the PC that's attached to it, which is going to be beneficial for certain uses, especially if the PC is being swapped in and out. If you had it, say, in a creative space that was shared between 2 or 3 individuals. So we've got a good selection of ports. This is also going to be a mini LED backlight. So we're getting apparently a rated 1,000,000:1 HDR contrast ratio, which is of course overinflated with the way they measure them, and that's an HDR mode, and 13,000:1 an SDR. This is going to be a $5,000 panel. So, and I believe it'll come with the stand. Unlike certain other professional panels. So they're definitely releasing a good high-end panel here. Other features I've seen on this is it has a monitor shade in the promo images, although I'm not sure if that comes with it or is an added accessory. It's certainly a nice touch and is going to improve things like glare on the monitor, and they're fairly popular with creative professionals. So those are Dell's new monitors. They're all a bit out of my budget. I'd certainly love to get my hands on that 32-inch HDR panel, even if it does mean making my monitor smaller. I'm sure my desk would appreciate taking a little bit of the load off. None of these are gaming panels, if anyone was thinking about that. These are all definitely focused on work and creative professionals, not high-end gaming. Dell has other monitors in their lineup for that. Although VOTech did launch that 4K mixed-use panel that hopefully we get a look at soon. Speaking of VOTech, if anyone missed it, we did like the VOTech panel we reviewed a while ago. That was a 24-inch, 144Hz VA panel. If you're looking for something like that, just as a refresher, there'll be a link to it in the description below. Our final item this week, I am still trying to figure out the best way to test that Pokit Meter. I've used it a little bit, and it works. I used it a little bit for some low voltage work I was doing at the office on a security card system, and was pleased with its performance there. But I mean, that's just testing which cables have 5 volts DC and which ones don't. So that's not exactly a great evaluation of its capabilities as a multimeter or an oscilloscope. I have been suggested that I may build an audio cable and hook it up to the sound output on something like one of my USB audio interfaces and send a specific tone and record the wave that the oscilloscope sees, and I may attempt to do that in the next week or two. Another thing I'm trying to figure out, and tell me in the comments below if I'm right or wrong on this. Just looking at what resistors I can get easily enough. If I was to purchase, we'll say 10,000 ohm 1% resistors and put them all in parallel, I know what the resistance would be. I know I would have a 100 ohm resistor in parallel. What I don't know is how to handle the percent error on that. Would I now have a 100 ohm 0.1% resistor, or would I have something else? So I'm trying to figure that part out, and it may be that it's not as simple. So I'd love to hear some input on that in the comments below. And the reason I said 10, 1% resistors is I can find resistors below 0.1%, although I can find 0.1% resistors, although they're fairly expensive. Going beyond that gets more and more prohibitively expensive, or just is impossible to find as a commodity item. So odds are, whatever I do, if stacking resistors in parallel decreases the error, that's going to give me a more accurate measure on what the meter can do as far as at least the resistance measurement's concerned. Voltage wise, I may end up having to just get a validated DC benchtop power supply, since some of my normal testing, check what mains voltage is, things like that, aren't necessarily valid for this. I can't hook it up to the panel when it only goes to 60 volts for its capabilities. Not that a meter the size of a silver dollar is something I anticipated putting 220 volts through. Prime Day is coming this week, and everyone and their uncle is putting together lists of the best deals for Prime Day and the best early deals for this and best early deals for that. We may have an article about that when Prime Day goes live if there is something particularly good or something we have reviewed that is a particularly good deal. With that said, I'm not going to waste all your time on that. Most of those articles are beneath our readers and our viewers. What I will do is I will include a link to a couple of the main Amazon sites, things like Audible, things like Amazon itself, in the description here using our affiliate links. And if you are interested in helping support Pocketables, I'm going to encourage you to use those. That doesn't cost you anything to help support us that way, and it helps us purchase bits and pieces of equipment that we need. Things like those resistors and that benchtop power supply I mentioned for the Pokit Meter. Unlike Patreon, which if you do want to help support Pocketables, I do encourage you to check out. You can support Pocketables through Patreon and help us make content that way as well. And once again, like I said, there'll be Amazon links in the description. There'll be a Patreon link in the description. Finally, I want to thank Electrix for providing our opening and closing themes. If you like his music, check out his channel. If you are looking for music for anything, including exactly the same thing we use it for, send him a message. He has been fantastic to work with. All that said, thank you for watching.